Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the strategies for multiplying decimals by decimals. So here we go. The first thing we're going to talk about is multiplying them by using models with 100 blocks. You can see the models right here, and we're going to take it one step at a time. So the first step is to take your first decimal number, that's your first factor, and shade that many squares in your hundreds block horizontally. That means side to side. So my first number is 4/10. I'm going to shade 4 of those rows. That's because it's 4/10. The next step is to take the second decimal, and that's your second factor, and shade, but this time you're going to shade the opposite direction. So since we already shaded side to side, now we're going to do up and down in the vertical direction. So the second number is 6/10, so I need to shade in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. Step 3 is just to count how many boxes are overlapped by both shades, which means I have to put them together now. And usually I don't separate them, we put them in the same area model. So we're going to do that now. I just separated them here so you can see the two different steps. So step 3 is kind of like step 1 and 2, and then here comes step 3. So here's step 1 again, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then step 2 again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because those were my two factors that I'm multiplying. And then step 3 is count the area right here where they have two shades, the green and the orange. So I'm going to color that in purple so you can see it. So that's going to be 6 little squares right there, and then I have another row of 6, so 6 and 6, that's 12. Another 6 is 18, and the last 6 will give me 24. So that represents 24 little hundreds. 24 hundreds is my final answer. And that's how you do it. Now, let's talk about how you do it with the standard algorithm. The standard algorithm is really easy. Actually, it's a lot easier than the models, because you don't have to color anything in, and you don't have to use colors or anything like that. This is more of a more useful, so it can be done faster, and you can do it any place. Especially like on your test and things like that. So let's take it one step at a time as well so you can really understand it. Step 1 is just to multiply as you would any whole number. So in this case, you can see that step 1 is shown right here next to it, and we're going to scratch off those little decimal points because whole numbers don't have decimals. So we're just going to pretend they're not there. So really all we have to multiply is just the number 6 times the number 4. 6 times 4 is 24, so we're done with step 1. Super easy. Now, step 2, count how many digits you have after every decimal point in the problem. And this is where it can get a little confusing, because you're like, what do you mean count the digits and after the decimal point in the whole problem? Well, I like to simplify things for you. So I call this method the bubble strategy. So go ahead and write this down so you can remember it. Whenever I talk about the bubble strategy in class, you can see what I'm talking about. So the bubble strategy is simple. Just draw 3 bubbles, one for the first number, one for the second number that you're multiplying, the first and the second factor, and finally the product, the answer to the multiplication. Now the way we're going to fill in the numbers, you can see they're already filled in here in step 2, but I'm going to explain to you how we fill in those numbers. So the first thing is look for your decimal point. Now we don't want to ignore it. Now that we're finished multiplying, now we want to come back and take care of that decimal. Because when we multiply decimals, we don't necessarily have to line up the decimal. If they end up lined up, like in this problem, that's okay. But we only really line them up when we add or subtract decimals. When we multiply decimals, like in this case, we don't care where the decimal is, because according to our first step, we need to multiply as if they were just whole numbers. So that's why we need to ignore the decimal until we're finished multiplying. Alright, so going back to step 2. Find your decimal point and count how many numbers you have to the right of the decimal point or behind the decimal point. In the first factor, all you do have is the 4. So that's just one number. That's why we put a 1 inside that bubble, because we're just counting how many numbers we have behind the decimal. On the second factor, which is the 6/10, there's my decimal, and my only number behind the decimal is the 6. So again, it's just one number. And then that means that we have another 1 in that bubble. The final bubble, the one for your answer, needs to have the sum of the first two bubbles, which means you're just adding them together. So kind of like when you're blowing bubbles, like an actual bubble with like soapy water, and you blow and you make the little bubbles. If you have a little bubble and another little bubble and they kind of come together, they make a bigger bubble, right? Well, that's what you're doing here. It's just one bubble with a 1 and another bubble with a 1. You put them together, 1 plus 1, it gives you the answer of 2. So we're done with step 2. That's all we're doing in step 2. Just counting, putting the bubbles and putting numbers inside the bubbles. Pretty easy. All right, step 3. I think this is the easiest one of them all. It's just moving the decimal point to the left. And it says as many places as there are digits behind the decimal. So that can be kind of confusing for some of us. So again, let's go back to the bubbles. Let's look at the last bubble that we have for step 3. We go back to step 2 and say there were 2 places because the last bubble was a 2. There was a 2 inside the last bubble in my answer. That just means I have to move my decimal point in my answer 2 times. So my answer right now is 24. That's a whole number. Let's go back to step 3. There's my decimal point behind the 24 because all whole numbers have a decimal point behind them. It's kind of hiding there. You don't really have to put it, but it's like $24. It'll be like 24.00, like $24.00. Okay, so you could write it like this if you needed to write $24, if we were talking about money in this case. But we're not, so we don't need to. So the decimal is sitting right there. All we really have to do is move it as many times as this last bubble tells me. So because we have 2 in that one, all we have to do is move it 1 time, 2 times, and there's my decimal. So now my final answer, I just have to write it in proper decimal form, which means normally if there is no whole number, we put a 0 for the whole number. So there's my decimal. I put a 0 in the whole number place. I box it in, and that's my final answer. So to review, step 1, multiplies whole numbers. Step 2, use your bubble strategy to count how many numbers are behind the decimal, and then you will put the 2 bubbles together to get the final bubble at the end for your answer. And then finally move that many decimal places, move the decimal point that many decimal places in the final product to the left. And that's it. You got your answer. So we're going to practice it now. Here's some problems that we're going to have to complete so we can get really good at this. Okay? The directions are there. It says solve the decimal multiplication problems by shading in the hundreds block. Then we're going to check our work by using the standard algorithm. That's the bubbles for the decimal multiplication. So the first thing that I see is I have a 7/10. So I'm going to color in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 rows represent 7/10. That was step 1 whenever we were talking about that strategy. Step 2 is do the same thing for the second number, but now we're going to do it in the opposite direction. So since we already went side to side, that's the horizontal way. Now we're going to go up and down, which is the vertical way. So here we go. We only have 2 tenths, so we only color in 2 columns. The product is the area where you have the double shade. So that's going to be that little bitty section that I highlighted with my blue outline, and that gives me 7 and 7 in each one of those columns. So that means that I have a total of 14. But remember, 14 is just a whole number, and right now we don't have a whole number. We have a part of a whole number. We only have a little bitty section in there. We don't have the whole entire thing with 2 shades. So that means that we have 14 little squares, and each square represents 1/100th because it takes 100 of them to make a whole entire grid. So that means that we have 1400. So we have to put a 0 in the whole numbers place and then box in our answer. Well, we'll box it in a few minutes when we check. Let's check with our standard algorithm. Step 1 is to ignore the decimals, multiply as if they were just whole numbers. So there's no 0, there's no decimal. It's just 7 and 2. So 7 times 2 is 14. Done. Step 2, the bubbles. There's my 3 bubbles, 1 for each number that I'm multiplying and 1 for my answer. The first bubble is going to have the number 1 because there's only 1 digit behind the decimal, which is a 7. My second bubble is going to have also a 1 because we only have 1 number behind the decimal. So now I'm going to put the 2 bubbles together. 1 plus 1 gives me 2, which means I'm going to move my decimal from the right, where it is hiding right now, to the left 2 times, because that's what my bubble ends up being. So when I do that, there's my decimal, and I put a 0 in front of it to have good mathematical form, and now I can check my answer, and they both match. So that means that I got the right answer. Here's number 2. I'm going a little faster, so I don't have to explain this over and over, because this video is getting a little long, and I don't want to keep you forever here. If you need me to slow down or to repeat something, just rewind the video, push pause as you need to. So number 2, 3/10. So here we go, 1, 2, 3/10, model side to side, and then the second number is 9/10. So here we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of those columns. My product is the double shaded section. So that means that I have 9 and 9 and 9. Well, that's going to give me 27 hundredths. And if I do that with the standard algorithm, 3/10 times 9/10, 3 times 9 is 24. I'm 24, 27. And then give my 3 bubbles there so that I can fill in the correct number inside. My first bubble is going to have a 1. Second bubble is going to have a 1. And my third bubble is going to have a 2, because 1 plus 1 is 2. Move the decimal twice to the left, and my answer is going to be 27 hundredths, which matches the answer for my model. Number 3, 4/10. There's 4 rows colored in. 2/10. There's 2 columns colored in. The area that's double shaded is my answer. So I have 8 little boxes there. That means that I have 8 hundredths. Make sure the 8 is in the correct place value. The second place value after the decimal is the hundredths place. So that's where there's a 0 in the tenths place. And there's also a 0 in the whole number place, in the ones place, because we have nothing as the whole. Standard algorithm, 4/10 times 2/10. Well, 2 times 4 is 8 bubbles. 1 for the first bubble, that was only 1 digit. 1 for the second bubble, and 1 plus 1 is 2. So move the decimal twice. Here's the trick. Whenever you move it twice, if you only have 1 digit in your product, you have to fill in a 0 for that spot that's available. You have to put a placeholder there. And now you put the good mathematical form with a 0 for the whole, for the ones place, and the answers match. Number 4, 5/10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6/10 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. The double shaded area is these little 30 little squares, so my answer is 30 hundredths. If I multiply using the standard algorithm, by the way, before I do that, notice that I can take off this 0 right here, because 3/10 is the same thing as 30 hundredths. And I'll prove that to you. If I take this little 5 hundredths and put them right here, I have 1 entire column, which is 1/10. If I take the next 5 and put them right here, I can rearrange them to make another column, and that gives me another 10th. And I do the same thing with the last 5 over here on the side, and that gives me another column. So I have 3 columns that represents 3/10. So it could be 3/10 or it could be 30 hundredths. It's the same number, same value. All right, having said that, we're going to check our work with the standard algorithm. So 5/10 times 6/10. 6 times 5 is 30. Bubble, bubble, bubble. The first bubble, it has a 1. Second bubble also has a 1, because each one of those just has 1 digit in behind the decimal. And 1 plus 1 is 2. So that means I have to move the decimal 2 times to the left, and my answer becomes 0 and 30 hundredths, or 3/10, either way. That gives me the same answer. All right, we have 3 more problems and then we're done. And now I'm going super fast, so that, because you should have plenty of practice by now, you should understand every step that I'm doing. So we have 6/10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 9/10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The double shaded area is that highlighted in blue, and that ends up being 54 little boxes, which represent 54 hundredths. To double check that, I'll do my algorithm. So 6/10 times 9/10, and 6 times 9 is 54. Bubble, bubble, bubble. 1 for my first bubble, 1 for my second bubble, and 2 for my third bubble when I add them together. Move the decimal twice to the left, because that's the last bubble, that's what it tells me. And my answer is 54 hundredths, which they do match. I'm going to jump to number 7, and then I'll come back to number 6. So number 7 says Paul has 3/10 cups of sugar. I'm going to model that with 3 columns. And then it says that she uses, that's a mistake there. It shouldn't say she, it should say he, because we're talking about Paul. Usually Paul is a guy's name, right? So that's just a typo. So he uses 6/10 in his, again another typo, in his chocolate chip cookies. How much how much sugar did he use? Maybe I should just change the word Paul to, I don't know, Paula, or maybe left it as a she. Anyways, so we have 3/10 already modeled. The next number that I have to model is 6/10, because I'm only using a part of those 3/10 cups that I have. So I'm going to model it like this with my 6 columns, and that means that I'm only really using this much sugar, which is the double shaded. So that gives me a total of 18 little squares, so it's 1800s. We can definitely double check that with the algorithm if you choose to, but number 7 didn't have a place for the algorithm, so I'm not going to do that. You can do that on your own to see if you can practice the bubble strategy. Now let's go back to number 6 real quick on a new screen, so I have some little space to do it. You have the 8/10, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times 7/10, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The double shaded area comes out to be 5600ths. If I double check that with my standard algorithm, I multiply 8 times 7, that's 56. I use my bubble strategy. I'll have a 1, 1, 1. I mean a 1 and 1, and for my 2 bubbles, and 1 plus 1 is 2. So I have to move my decimal twice to the left, and that gives me my answer of 5600ths, which matches that. So that's it. That's all the practice problems that we're going to go over in this video. Hopefully this helped you on knowing how to multiply a decimal by a decimal with the area models, with the hundreds blocks, and also with the standard algorithm, which is my bubble strategy. All right, hopefully that helps you.